imagination, prophecy, enlightenment, and truth. These are the four principles of the Transcendent Worlds. Four worlds, fitted with galaxies, realms, and planets abound. Who am I, you may ask? I am the mysterious stranger. I will be your guide through these vast worlds. Worlds fitted into these universes. These are the tales that we wish to tell, that I have the honor to share with you. These are the tales of the verse.
Trust. The bond between all living things, built on truth, vulnerability, and honesty. Trust is what either brings people together or pushes them from each other. In essence, trust is the bond, the chain that brings all things and links them together. Now, imagine a world where you couldn't trust the person next to you, not even your own friend, where that trust was constantly tested because the person sitting next to you may look normal, act normal, and even seem normal. But deep under the flesh, the teeth, the eyes, there hid a monster or something far worse. And indeed, I refer to a world within the transcendence. Deep within the ether, there lies a plane of existence, another world, a world very much like your own, like an earth, like a place where politics and economics were very similar, democracy at the forefront, a world filled with people going about their jobs, their careers, going to their families, and making their own destiny. What a simple life, a peaceful life. Like your world, they dealt with political and social struggles, seeking to achieve that utopian society that all civilizations seek after. Indeed, this world was very much like yours, except their politics were slightly different, their religions vastly dynamic, and the people believed in a very deep underlying culture of hope. You see, hope to them were a part of the finite pieces of their society, of their relationships, and of the building blocks of their character. Hope indeed was attached to the ideas of trust. This civilization believed in trusting your neighbor, trusting your friend, your family, and giving strangers the benefit of the doubt. Now, not everyone in this world was perfect, far from it. But everyone, at least the majority, strived for something greater. Yet, it is the hubris of mortality to invite things that are, let us say, quite strange and even dangerous. For in this civilization, they sought to acquire a power that within the ether was both unnatural, ununderstandable, and unobtainable. I do refer to a power that some would deem as the void. The people in this world believe that the void, this dark matter, this endless abyss, could harness something greater, a power over immortality, or knowledge, or even a power over death. The ideas behind it were limitless, but they were only theories. The scientists and the politicians began to enact a great project, a project to harness this power. But like many things, when nature is tested and prod at, tend to find retaliation. For when the people of this world broke into the power, this unnatural source, it began to break open the sky. And it became a day, not like the ordinary day these people had seen, but a terrible and awful day. A day that they now call the Day of Mourning. It was called this for a number of reasons. Many had cried out as they saw the sky shatter like glass and enter into a vast black abyss. They referred to this abyss as the Endless. It was a deep and almost eternal pit of darkness. The sky filled with black and purple. Nothing could be seen. Not even the night starry sky could find its way through the terrible crack that now lied within the atmosphere. Truly, the world was now broken. For many days the people did stare into that endless void, wondering what it was, what they had done. In truth, the people of this world had become so prideful and so overconfident in their abilities to harness powers beyond their potential. And so, they had created the end, a beginning of an end. And so they called this great abyss the Endless, for it stretched beyond their wildest imagination and even their greatest fears. Those who looked into the Endless saw different things. Some saw their greatest fears and woes. Others saw only despair and hopelessness. Very few saw opportunity, potential, and even a new fate. And the smallest amount saw hope, for they saw a great light deep in the Endless. Now, as each saw something different, each became something different. Those who looked into the Endless and saw only despair, who only saw the terrible and awful, frightening display before them, they became their fear. They became monsters, creatures of unnatural shape and size. They became their vices, their greatest and darkest secrets. People had caught on to calling these monsters, as they were, the speechless. For when they looked upon the Endless, they could not speak, nor utter any word from their tongues. They could only look in great horror and fall into madness. The speechless roam all across the wastelands of the world. They're everywhere, deep in the cracks and crevices, further in the caves, or even hiding in plain sight. Some of them look like people, but turn into beasts or terrible creatures when they finally cannot handle the urges within them. Others are what they are. They do not hide. They are the monsters that have been hiding within them since the endless had revealed itself. And those who fell into despair, they are the faithless. Unlike the monstrous speechless, the faithless gave into something else. The utter loss of hope. They don't seek it, they can't find it, they don't have it. They become one with the environment, some becoming nothing but dust and ash. Others become statues, almost like skeletal humans left behind by time. And those that cling on to the smallest bits of life are monsters within themselves. For though they are not like the speechless, with their gnashing teeth, their grotesque features, and their estranged limbs and body, the faithless were just as frightening. Some would lose faces and become like statues or golems. Others, giants, but with rocky features and cracked parts. And very few began to become one with the elements. And their appearance, though almost like art, was so unnatural that some people can barely think as they stare at them. And those who had clinged on to something quite different, they had clinged on to fear, but in a different way. They had taken fear and made it a weapon, a tool, a power. And so the endless became their great awakening. The endless awakened them. They became shadowy beings, beings that, like miniature voids, hunted the speechless. It's almost for sport, you see. They had made a pact with the remaining survivors who had not gone any way, had not gone down any of these dark paths. And so survivors made a pact with these void-like beings, these people who had become one with the endless's power, and they used them. They would hunt the speechless and keep back the faithless, while the survivors, being safe, would give any resources, any materials, or anything that these void-like warriors would desire. And so this symbiotic relationship was made, and these void-like warriors became known simply as Headhunters. They would claim the head of those they hunted as a sign of, well, their work, and that they had accomplished it, and they would go and give it to the survivors. The survivors would use the heads as a way to ward off other speechless, hanging them from spears and gate walls, all to frighten them, to let them know that here the Headhunters dwelt. For if there was one thing the speechless hated the most, it was Headhunters. For even they had no fear, no emotion, no remorse, and even no hope. For without hope, for the voidless warriors, these Headhunters, it gave them the power over fear. Now, the survivors were not totally defenseless. They mustered any weapons that remained and continued to try to create, industrialize, and keep civil. And anyone who fell to the endless would have to be cast out and allowed to, let's say, take its course through their veins. For those people would become whatever the endless seemed to deem them to become. There was a fourth, but rare, almost a myth. These were the people who saw hope when they saw the endless. These people were known as the inspired. No one knew what they were quite like. No one even knew where they were, or if they were even real. What was known is that the inspired were said to give great bursts of hope and light to wherever they went. They scared Speechless, but Speechless would always try to hunt and kill them, for the taste of the inspired was quite delicious, they said. They also said that the inspired were often hunted by the faithless, most especially. This was because the faithless had no hope, and so to feel just even the smallest, tiniest form of hope, they hunted after the inspired. Headhunters and survivors, on the other hand, kept them nearby, for it made them feel safe, or they were quite useful to those who had them around. But because no one had seen nor heard of an inspired being in these parts, these being the wasteland down in South Bar, no one ever thought to go looking for one. And if anyone had found one, they would most likely keep it to themselves. For down in South Bar, there were only 3 remaining settlements. 3 that stood high and tall. And in these lands, there were certainly headhunters. And there was one who was more fearsome, more ruthless than the rest. His name was Talinus. Shh! Listen. There it goes. One of the speechless, dwelling in its lair. They call them wailers, for their cry is a frightening and terrible howl. They wail like a dying hound, dying in the dark night. Their eyes burning like an orangish red flame, their ears pointed, so pointed in fact, it almost looked painful. Their lips drawn back, revealing fangs, sharp and long and twisted. Somewhat muscular, with long, sharp fingers, and hind legs and arms that could tear a man in a matter of seconds. The wailers were about the size of a large wolf. They were almost like wolves, humanoid dog-like men or women. They crawled on all fours, sniffing in the air. Their back legs were not like humans. They were bent and strangely formed, almost like that of a normal dog's, except these were large and terrible to look at. They were grotesque in nature, and these creatures were also of a frightening appearance. But usually, wailers do not travel on their own. They usually come in packs. He smelled something. Something in the shadows. Something terrible. In a moment, it grabbed him. Lifted him up into the air, smashed him to the ground, and as it pulled up its limp body, it opened up its gaping mouth. Large, sharp, buck-like teeth chomping down at the head of the whaler, nibbling on it like a mantis. Its arms were long, stretched like rubber, with bones sticking out of its elbows and its nails. It had a large body, similar to that of a mantis or a spider, insect-like almost. It had large, sharp-ended legs, much like that of an ant. Its legs were counted up to 4, while its arms, sometimes used as legs, made it 6. 6 nasty, terrible limbs. It had green, palish skin, with dark, bruised-like spots, and its eyes were sunken back, almost not even there. And the creature itself emitted strange noises.
Please have mercy. What more?
These noises emitted as it chewed and tore apart. This was the Gapper, a creature that every time it killed someone or something, it replicated their noises, their screams, their moans of pain and distress. It was certainly both a quiet, quick, and vicious killer. Its snake-like nostrils could smell something. What could it be? What could it be indeed? Only one thing did a Gapper truly fear. As it dropped down the corpse of its half-eaten meal, it began to hiss. It saw it, stepping out of the shadows. Dark, bird-like claws. But they had no details. They were shadowy, large, long, and they came from a large body, a shadowy, withering being. Its eyes were white like the stars at moonlight, but even more fearsome, more intimidating. They were pale white, endless white, piercing eyes. It came from the shadows, covered in a withered cloth. It was both a cape and a robe. These withered clothes were almost hanging off of it as if they weren't even really on this creature. And this creature had a strange head, for whenever its head moved, it was almost like traces of it were left behind, almost lagging. And every time it moved, you could see the strange withers of shadows. Indeed, this was a headhunter, and its head was that of a raven. Its eyes looked directly at the Gapper. The Gapper hissed more. Beginning to click, it began to put itself into a almost predatory stance. The headhunter tilted his head, looking directly at the Gapper. He moved slowly, methodically, taking and buying his time. Each step was heavy, almost unnatural for something that looked almost unreal, almost not there like the air. The gapper continued to hiss. And as he approached, he said in a low, yet sharp voice,
"Your head is mine."
The gapper hissed again and charged right at the headhunter. He leaped like a ball of shadow, jumping onto the back end of the gapper, and the gapper screamed. It knew its time was nearly out. Reaching towards its back, crawling all over the place in a frantic speed like a spider, it crawled all over, screeching and crawling all over, and then the fall of the head and the drop of the body. It shook the nearby ground, and the head toppled over. Its big, bulging head rolled over and hit a stone. There, a strange, oozing black-green ooze came from both the neck and the orifice of the head and mouth. The headhunter slowly approached, lifting the head up with his dark, withering hands, and said,
"It looks like a good kill. They will be pleased. Now I must depart, deep into the wastes."
And depart he did. The wastes were grey, withering. It was as if dust covered every speck of the land. There were, of course, old stone and metal ruins. Once towering buildings, high in the sky, touching the clouds, and others, what were once magnificent structures, libraries, police stations, the old courthouse, or the school, homes and beggared houses. Now, they were simply crypts, tombs for the old and the dead. The faithless at the edges of the wastes stared hopefully as they saw the headhunter drag the dumb head of the gapper. The faithless stretched out their hands wantfully, hoping that he would give something to help them with their troubles. But the headhunter did not look. Them like beggars in the streets, asking for alms, and he, too high and mighty, or, in this case, not caring for their pity. He did not seek to give them anything that would only cause their despair to sink deeper. Passing them by like one would pass a clove of flowers in the grass, he did not mind them. And he did enter into the gates of a large and spacious city. After the day of mourning, there were not many cities that had remained. The once noble capitalist city had fallen into waste. In its stead was now where South Bar laid. And within South Bar there were 3 settlements. They were the last beacons of hope for all of mankind in this part of the land. The 3 settlements consisted of a place named after South Bar itself, simply called South Bar, another known as Cannon Place, off towards the east, and finally, the one that was somewhat central towards the south was New Hope. New Hope was a settlement that was formed as a marketplace, a trading co, and it supplied most of the other settlements, and any other places where survivors dwelt. New Hope was certainly a beacon of hope in these dark and trying times. It had been almost nearly 2 decades since the day of mourning, and New Hope still stood strong. It had taken 5 years to build, and yet it was still standing miraculously. A headhunter like Talinus, however, saw it as a means to an end, a place where one could get good payment for good work. Ooze continued to squirt out of the head of the gapper. Talinus dragged it, having hooked chains and ropes and hooks into its head, pulling and pulling across the entire dirt road of New Hope. All eyes trailed upon it, and people shuddered as they saw it. A hideous thing it was, and the smell far worse. It was like that of rotten eggs and turned onions, and with a small flare of dead flesh. It was a terrible smell, to say the least. As he drew the head, he pulled it over towards a small tent, and out came Gentry.
Ah, good to see you, Talinus. I didn't think we would have you come back for another...
He plopped the head upon the table, cutting off Gentry from finishing his sentence.
Ah. Well, I see that you got a head.
Indeed.
Talinus said plainly.
Payment would be in order.
Gentry and Talinus had known each other for several years, almost since the beginning of New Hope. Talinus had been hunting many a folk and creature that had dwelt in the outskirts. He had even hunted humans for several times, for bandits had gone wild and crazy, creating cults in the outer wastes.
Well, don't be hasty now. We gotta get our funds together and see if there's any resources we can share with you.
Be quick. I have other matters to attend to.
All right.
Gentry whistled for help. Out came a young man with black, rugged hair, a face that was somewhat matured, with a sharp chin, but he still had the look of someone who had not seen much in his life, or lacked any experience.
Now, Carter, go on and fetch us some goods. Get some good resources, the fine stuff. We don't want our fine headhunter here going off with nothing.
Carter looked over towards where Gentry was pointing. Turning back, he had a look of both sadness, depression, and anger. For as he looked at Talinus, he clenched his fist, his teeth tightened, and his eyes fixed upon the shadowy figure before him. I ain't doing nothing. The area fell silent. Even some of the shoppers and tradesmen nearby grew quite silent, whispering right before them.
Now, Carter, you don't want to cause any trouble.
I want to cause some trouble. They come in here all the time, collecting whatever they want from us. Our fine goods, our food.
Now, Carter, they don't eat nothing, except scraps from some of their kills. But those don't even matter. The point being
that they take from us, and they kill those things, and they go off scot-free. I could go out there myself and shoot one of them down and... Talinus approached him. His head hung right over Carter. He was like a great and enormous mountain before him. And his presence, it was quite strange. Headhunters had the presence of someone who had neither fear nor remorse. For when they looked at you, it was as if they were calculating a simple equation. It was never a matter if it was rightfully moral or not. It was simply the kill, the hunt, and how would it be done.
Now, Carter, Talinus, he's a young boy. He's a bit brash. Carter, how about you go fetch him some of those trinkets right over there for Miss Harley? Carter stuttered. All right, Mr. Gentry. I'll go get some. Carter eyed Talinus, but soon he broke concentration. He couldn't look at him any longer, and turned away and ran off. Now, he's a young'un. He don't mean anything by it. Talinus turned towards Gentry, and then looked back.
It is always a pity when those who are of our blood disappoint us with their wounds.
Now, hold on. I've never told anyone that he was my son. How did you know? Talinus looked to the ground and began to pace near the table where he had placed the head of the Gapper.
I know things many do not. I forethought that you might catch on. I suppose I am mistaken.
Well, I suppose I never thought to tell you that I had a son, nor did I think you would ever find out. Gentry had always been quiet about his personal life, but he always prodded at what Talinus was doing on the outskirts of the wastes. He knew he would go there, for scouts had spotted him before, but he never understood why he would go out so far. Well, anyways, I'll get you a fine picking for all of this, well, I guess it's just one, but this head right here. Where'd you come by it?
I found it in the abandoned library, off towards the western corner.
Western corner? Those are dangerous places out there. I'd say we'll be willing to give you a few, small pieces of tech, and we'll be willing to trade off.
I do not want any more technological pieces. I would care for a soul capsule.
A soul capsule was one of the most rarest of resources in all of the wastes, even more so than the heads of the creatures the Headhunters hunted. For soul capsules were what gave them life, strength, energy. Headhunters did not need them to survive, mind you, but they certainly gave them more joy or pleasure, for it was the only way to feel such things for a headhunter. Well, we only got one left, but we were hoping, at least Joshua was hoping to save it for your next job.
You have another assignment? Another task?
Yeah, we do. If you're up for the job, otherwise we could...
No. The hunt is mine. I shall claim it.
Well, that's the thing. It isn't quite a hunt.
No. What is it?
A moment later, Joshua had been called forth. Joshua was a dark-skinned man, tall, strong, who radiated with a purity to him. He was one of the most virtuous, most brave men in all of New Hope. Next to Gentry, of course, who was a delightful man as it was. But Joshua was a man of destiny. And he was a man focused on the idea of getting things done, with a very particular and determined mind to it. Finally, it is good to see you, Talinus. Well, yes. Now, to business. We've gotten word, about a month or two ago, of another settlement.
Another? Where?
To the west, far on the reaches of the wastes, near a place where weather is still intact. We were hoping, for we sent a letter back but did not receive any other word from them, that you might be able to find survivors. Yeah, we were under the impression that they perished, or that at least a few of them did. Our hope is that there's still many among that old settlement.
Unlikely.
Well, we thought so too. Both Gentry and Joshua looked quite sad. They had hoped that perhaps this settlement was a sign that people were thriving, even in this dark, barren wasteland. But the truth was, it was a struggle even for the finest of settlements, the strongest of people, to make do. Either way, we would desire that you would go and find survivors. We will pay you no matter what. And if you find more people, then perhaps we will give you more.
And you wish to pay the soul capsule for this job. This task.
Indeed. And of course, anything else that you might be in need of, Gentry remarked.
I will do it under one condition.
They leaned in, curious, hopeful, and a bit scared at what his request might be. Go on.
If you give me the soul capsule for this job, then I would require instead firelight for the job that I have just given you. This head.
Talanis stroked his hand across the head of the Gapper. Joshua and Gentry looked at one another. Joshua with a look of concern, and Gentry with a look of eagerness. Well, we would be willing. We certainly would be willing. We got a little bit to spare. Joshua, somewhat disappointed at his response, agreed. Indeed, we can spare some firelight. Firelight was the only source of energy that had been extracted from the Inspired. It is what they had from any of the Inspired that they were able to find or save, and at times it was the last remnants of the Inspired that had passed on. Handing over something like this was more valuable than anyone could imagine, for it was a beacon of light in this perilous darkness. Well, there you go. One lantern. A lantern with an orange golden flame flickering in it, almost as if it was about to go out, but continuously striving to keep lit. Talanis picked it up, attaching it to the side of him, with seemingly nothing holding on to it, but it hung nonetheless. He pushed the head of the Gapper towards Joshua, who began to unhook it and give the chains and ropes back to Talanis.
Good business, gentlemen.
Indeed. Indeed. Now, we'll give you some directions. You're gonna want to go...
I will be able to find it. Simply point me in the direction, and I shall find the source of the settlement.
I won't argue with that. As you wish. I'll lead you back to the gate. As Gentry pointed out towards the directions past the gate, Talanis nodded, and with one stroke of his cape, he flipped it and said,
I shall return.
And he departed. Talanis did not trust many people. He did not wish to get to know them, and he did not care of their matters unless they had something to do with him. Now, do not be mistaken. He did, in a way, care for the people of New Hope. But it was in the same way that a hungry dog, coming back to the same house looking for food, cared for them. Always looking for the spoils of someone willing to give them. Yet Talnis did watch carefully over those at New Hope. No one ever knew why. Maybe he didn't either. But regardless, this was just another job. One for the payment of something very valuable for any headhunter. The wastes blew with a harsh yet haunting wind. It was like that of the wailing of a banshee or ghost, haunting and decrepit. Yet, for a headhunter like Talanis, it was simply like a fine instrument being played in the distance, music to his ears, for it was all too familiar. It was his home. It was his pride and joy to be a part of another hunt, despite it not guaranteeing the killing of a speechless. For some time, Talanis wandered the wastes. He passed by faithless, giant statue-like people left in the ground who had finally been silenced and had given up all hope and all faith in believing that it was worth living. Corpses sparingly apart across the wastes, crushing some of the bones as he walked across them. And more than anything, signs of speechless wandering in the wastes. There were some that flew like bats in the night, looking for prey, able to see in the dark, and when they found it, drain their blood and devour their flesh. There were others who slithered like snakes, whose faces were almost human, with arms on the sides, mimicking voices, luring people in with their greatest desires and wishes, and seeking for hope. There were others that mimicked the inspired by creating flashes of golden light, but as you approached, they were nothing more than an awful, monstrous husk glooming in the dark. There were all kinds of speechless. Many had tried to categorize them, but it seemed not to matter. More and more every day seemed to be made from the loss of hope every time the endless took a new victim. Talanis walked over more dunes of grey dust and ash, and as he approached a fallen building, he looked to the sky. His eyes flashed as he looked at the white, perilous light in the dark abyss. It had been there some time after the day of mourning. No one knew what it was. Maybe a symbol of hope, or maybe a sign that the beginning of the end was nigh. As he looked up, Talanis turned his eyes and tilted his head. He could sense something. Like sonar, or like a feeling deep in his heart. It's that kind of feeling you would get with deja vu. Or at least, for humans, it would be that way. But for headhunters, it was a feeling as if it were a sixth sense. It allowed them to sense things. Once a thought was put in their mind, they would be able to find anything that they desired. This is what made hunting speechless so easy. It's why the speechless feared them most. But this time, he could sense something else. A place. Far, very far from here. Past a couple of ruined buildings. Past a place known as the Gate. As he approached the gate, He saw the towering skyscrapers, once mighty, crushed against each other, building a strange vertical arch in the shape of a triangle.
This is the place.
Talnis said to himself. As he crossed over, he began to take lighter steps. A place like this could make for a perfect ambush. He walked carefully, scanning the arches, his eyes fixed all around, moving quicker than light itself. Nothing would be able to sneak up on him. Not even...
You!
He drew a dark, shadowy scythe in an instant. It formed like clouds gathering for a storm, but the edge was still as sharp as a metal blade, though it did not look it. He pointed towards a young boy, or at least he thought at a first glance that it was a young boy. No, he was no longer. He seemed to be turning.
Please, please have mercy on me. Please.
The young man spoke. Talnis could tell that he was at least at one point a young man, but his hair was thin. His fingers seemed to be fusing together in the shape of what looked to be swine's feet. His ears somewhat more pointed on one side than the other, and his eyes turning a slight blackish brown, a tooth sticking out of his right gum, and his nose protruding ever so slightly. His clothes were gray and ragged, and his face frightened beyond all compare.
I see. You are turning.
No, I'm not. It's just a slight... It's just a slight deformity. I promise.
No. It will take you. Allow me to set you free before the enlists takes its prey.
The young man grew more frightened. His face, though already white in ash, turned greater pale, almost sickly.
Please. I have nothing to live for. Please allow me just one more moment.
It would be better for you to fall than others to fall by your hand. Allow me. The choice is yours.
Talnis waited. The young man, turning away, said nothing.
Please. I'll do anything. I could show you. There are survivors out there. I know where they are.
Talnis stopped for a moment. He did not trust the swinebreed before him, but he also knew that if he could get information, he could deal with him after.
Survivors, where should we?
He quickly got up, brushing the dirt and dust off of him. He pointed offward and said,
Out there, I'll show you the way. Follow me.
As he continued forward, Talnis watched him crawl away, running off through the dust. He knew not to trust him. Speechless can't be trusted, never to be trusted. They are nothing but monsters, and I am their predator. He thought this as he wandered away, following after this strange squib. They came to an overlook. What seemed to be what formerly was a building, overlooked into a small canyon. It was not very far deep down. You could look down and see small details of what looked to be an old ruin. But Talnis already knew This was the settlement. What was strange about this place was it had to be less affected by the endless, for over here there was snow, which Talanis then realized it was winter. The rest of the land would never show this, for it was too overtaken by the endless, that the seasons were non-existent. The weather was simply determined by only factors of, well, the outside forces, like a place like this. Wind only blew in because of places like this. Otherwise, if you're in the wasteland, temperature was non-existent, which made people very unsettled any time they walked around. It was in the dark, deep places where cold dwelt. The heat could only be found further and further away from the endless itself, or the places it had taken.
Where are the survivors?
They're down there, I promise.
You promise.
Talanis looked away from him, almost thinking to himself, or at least that's what the young lad thought. But the young lad didn't trust this. He continued to cry. He continued to plead.
I showed you. It's a good place.
But Talanis knew better. As he slowly turned, he saw the transformation from one peak of his eye beginning to occur. The boy became mad, slobbering with spit and blood and a strange black liquid. His mouth and head protruded out with a large snout, and teeth came sticking out, forming tusks. His back bulged, hunched, and as he continued to whine, he screamed out,
I showed you.
He screeched. It was frightening, but to Talanis, it was simply an indication.
I told you, you were turning.
In one small sweep, almost effortlessly, Talanis departed his head, and the creature fell. Its body fell down to the ground, deep into the canyon. The head toppled next to Talanis. He lifted it up, hooked it to the ropes and chain that was attached to his waist, and it hung there. Talanis was quite large, so much so that the head almost seemed to disappear under his cloak and withering form. Talanis knew better, not to trust a stranger off in the wastes, especially one that was so clearly decrepit and lost. He knew that there was no one you could ever trust in these wastes. A sound broke the silence. Talanis' eyes fused into one white, glowing, bulging eye from his crow-like head. He peered down, and he saw more clearly. Something small moved and hid, and behind it, something followed. Talanis crept down the canyon, and eventually he began to slide. Almost drifting down the rocky wall, he came to the bottom, landing perfectly on his claws. He quickly rushed over to where the two small shadows had crept. He ran through, entering into a tent, and inside he found a whaler barking at a small figure hiding under cloth and pillows. He lifted up the lantern, and in a small voice said,
I am here, my prey.
The whaler turned and barked. Growling at Talanis, it saw the light and began to bark, spitting at him, trying to bite at it. He knew that it was drawn to the light. It wanted it. It hungered for it. And as it was distracted, he put up his right hand, formed a shadowy-like spear, and threw it right at the whaler's body. It pierced him to the ground. Its horrible whine as it bled to death right before Talnis's feet. It continued to bark, barking louder and louder, howling. Talnis then knew there were more.
I will make quick use of your head.
He took the head of the creature, hooked it to another part of his ropes and chains, and then turned. He glanced over to where there was small movement. It could not hide from his sight. And as he peeked down, he said,
Come out. Come out, little one. It is now dead.
A small creature came out of the cloth, but not a speechless, not even a faithless, but a small little girl. She was dirty, her dress ripped, torn, and smudged with all kinds of stains, her face forlorn, and tightly being held in her right hand was a stuffed animal, that of a bird. Talnis thought this to be interesting. Getting closer, the little girl backed up slowly, and he said, No.
Nothing to fear, little one. It is all right.
Talnis stopped for a moment. He did not understand why, so suddenly, he felt the need to be kind to this stranger. He tensed up.
Come, there is no time to waste.
She approached ever so slowly, and eventually grappled his hand tightly. It did not hurt Talnis at all. On the contrary, he felt almost nothing. But he could feel something else. Some small strand of some feeling that... A howl in the distance. Talnis, grabbing the girl quickly and turning back, he peered out the tent. There they were, on the high rocks, halfway on the canyon wall. Their eyes glowing reddish and orange, they were looking down. They were smelling them out, Talnis already knew. He knew their ways. They licked, they smelt, they heard. Anything to help them track their prey. They were always desperate for more.
Come, out the back. Quietly.
Talnis cut through the cloth and allowed the little one to go first, but she stood at his side, still clenching the shadowy hand. Talnis growled. He pulled the little girl along, and eventually he picked her up and put her on his back. She held ever more tightly onto his cloak, and as he ran away, so swift, like 5 winds blowing away through the ground, the whalers howled. It was an indication that they had found him. They rushed across the rocky well. Some of them falling to their deaths, so desperate to hunt him down. The rest crawled down some paths, and others ran along the rock wall, up above, but following ever so closely. Talnis, with every fiber of his speed, effortlessly moved across the rock and began to climb the wall. Using shadowy scythes, he pierced every slash into the wall, one after another, crawling it up, like a spider moving towards its prey. His determination could almost be seen as quite noble. For saving the small little girl with such a vast desperation to climb up the wall, it could be seen as a brave and heroic act. Yet, was it truly? Or was it simply the act of one trying to accomplish his mission? Talonus reached the ledge, crawled past it, and began to continue his speedy retreat. Behind, the girl looked back and saw them crawling up. They were fast. Some of them looked partly wounded, bleeding out. They had hurt themselves trying to get up the wall. They continued to bark and wail. Soon Talonus came to the next juncture. The arches. As he approached, he stopped and halted, quickly turning around, but his speed was too great and he skidded across the ground. The girl, almost falling off, continued to hold on with as much strength as she had, with one arm holding. As he turned around and slid, his scythe appeared and crushed into the ground, dragging along them, slowing his speed. The whalers gathered around, circling him about. There were at least 10, no, 20, and they continued to bark and howl, gnashing their teeth. It was a frightening sight. The girl hid her head into his cloak, slightly crying. He could sense this feeling. So much emotion. So much. He could not focus. He turned back to the whalers, his eye becoming fixed upon them. And then he screeched. The girl looked up suddenly. She gazed at the thing she was now holding on to, this creature she had only met a moment ago. It was more frightening than the whalers now. Shadowy tendrils came off of him, lifting up the cape and cloak. His head opened up like the large beak of a raven. The eye, white and glowing, bursted around with shadows, and the cry seemed to crack the glass around the arch, at least the glass that remained, and the whalers, they fell in fear. They cried out, barking and wailing. It was a frightening cry. They knew it was too dangerous, and so the whalers crept away. Some speedily ran into the darkness. Others slowly took steps back and eventually hobbled away. And others were so frightened they did not even move nor look up. It was finished. Talonus' eye returned to 2 pupils, white, glowing pupils. The tendrils retracted back into his shadowy form, and he looked around, and the girl was gone. Talonus looked around for a moment. He used the power of his senses. He could feel the rippling of different life forms nearby. The echoes, the cries. The whalers seemed to emit a small and pitiful cry, like that of a whining dog calling for its mother. As he looked around, he sensed a different one. It was more joyful, but still sad. He could sense it nearby one of the rocks, overhanging, piercing out of the arches. It was not too far off the ground. It carried a shadow that cast it over. And over towards it, Talonus could hear it. It was a small, faint cry. Not the cry of a wailing beast. No, it was a sad, sorrowful cry of one who had seen terrible things and could do nothing about it. One who had witnessed what she thought she could trust, but now was more frightened than ever. It was the cry of a little girl. Talinus approached the shadow. He saw her sitting under the rock, her hands holding tightly to her legs and knees. The small stuffed animal clenched between her legs and her face, tears wetting her clothes. Talinus felt something. He could not tell if it was a trick, if perhaps the endless had taken her and a new creature was being formed with new abilities. Either way, this feeling was quite strange. It was a feeling of emotion. Talinus quickly brushed it off.
Come, there is no time to weep, small one.
The girl continued to cry. She cried harder. Talinus groaned.
All right, it's all right.
He kneeled, putting his shadowy hand upon her shoulder, and then the other, and with the best effort tried to comfort her. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks, her eyes red from the sobbing. And then, as she slowly looked at him, she said,
"Who are you?"
Talinus, somewhat surprised, did not expect her to have spoken. He did not know if she was old enough to speak yet. Yet he replied,
You can call me friend.
Friend.
Yes, friend. Call me Talon.
The little girl reached out and touched his beak. It felt like a strange, fluffy cloud. But the feeling also came with strange, small, shadowy tendrils wrapping around her fingers ever so slightly. But she did not mind this. And as she touched the beak, she said,
Rue.
Is that your name?
She nodded her head.
Then, Rue, where are your people?
She did not answer. Her eyes went blank.
Where are your parents?
Again, silence. Her eyes staring ruefully into his.
They are dead.
Her eyes began to tear up again. She drew away her hand slowly and began to cry into her little pet. The stuffed animal was a black bird, Talinus noticed. It was a raven, worn and somewhat torn on the edges, and a little bit of fuzz sticking out of its belly. It had certainly seen quite a lot in its time. It was almost war-born. Something about it intrigued Talinus. As he looked at it, he pulled his arms away, took it slowly out of her hands, and as she looked up, surprised, he took the small little stuffed animal and began to pull something from his cloak, a needle and thread. He took the thread from his own cloak and began to spin it through the small stuff, and began to patch up the holes and fuzz that stuck out.
There, that's better.
He handed it back to her. She clenched it hard and pushed it and smudged it against her face, as if it was the only comfort in this world.
Now, we must go. There are others that dwell in these parts.
He lifted her up. He took her hand, and a new shadowy arm appeared from his body. One that was holding her hands became similar to that of a long snake-like hand, and it wrapped itself like a tentacle around her arm. It pulled gently, indicating that it was time to move, and she began to follow him. As Rue and Talanis went across the wastes, Talanis became more on edge. He did not know why. This small creature, why was it so important? Why was it making him feel things? He was very uncomfortable. As he continued to pull Rue along, they eventually came close to a hill. And upon the hill was a house. Above the house was a hand, giant hand, a rock stone-like hand. It was attached to the house, or the house was built around its fingers and palm, and the hand seemed to attach to a large body that was submerged under the dirt hills. Talanis could only figure that this was a faithless, and that this person must have gone in deep into the endless and lost all hope and faith. Talanis eyed the house closely.
I do not trust this place. Something of it reeks of...
Before he could finish, he felt something slip away. He turned back to his third arm. Rue was gone. Looking around so quickly, he gazed across the land, but could see nothing. Then he spotted a trail. Engaging his senses, his eyes fixed upon the trail, and he sensed that something had pulled her away. Or perhaps not pulled her away physically, but something had drawn her away. Talanis, following the trail, it led up to the house. It was a larger house, only half the size of a mansion. The door looked quite inviting, and so did the house itself now that Talanis looked at it. To him, he had no real feelings towards it, but he could sense that whatever the house was, whatever lied within, made it quite inviting. Talanis came to the door. As he reached for the latch, he found that as he opened it, there was nothing but a brick wall. Talanis eyed the wall. As he looked around, he noticed there was a hole nearby the steps of the house. As he looked down, he could hear voices. Talanis began to crawl down the hole, quietly. He knew if whatever it was had Rue, it would take no time in attacking, but he also knew that speechless tend to become more provoked when headhunters appear.
Now, sweetie, it's quite all right. You're fine now.
That monster has no hold on you anymore.
The voice echoed up the tunnel. Talanis could sense that whatever was speaking, its voice was not true.
Now come along. I have some fine biscuits and nice juice for you to drink up. Savory and good, crunchy, good for the soul, good for the heart.
As Talanis crawled down, it came to a submerged underbelly of a world. It was a cave-like place, dark and damp. The only light flickering was in the distance. Talanis took small steps. Any time he would step in water, the water would react, but would make no noise. Headhunters, indeed, were one of the most silent of killers.
Now, let Granny tell you an old story. You might find it boring, but you may even find it interesting. My old husband and I built this place long ago. It was such a wonderful place.
Talanis continued to step, and as he came closer, he approached a hill. Climbing over the hill, but keeping his body low, blending in with the darkness surrounding, he saw the light. It was a fire, a bonfire, in an area that was quite wide. Rue sat on a pile of something that Talanis could not make out from the distance that he was at. She was eating what looked to be the biscuits that were mentioned by this strange figure. The figure in question was an old woman. She looked harmless, peaceable, and her clothes, a little bit tattered, seemed still quite intact. She walked around the fire and reached for a glass of a colorful liquid, poured it into a glass, and brought it towards Rue. Talanis clenched his hands against the dirt. For some strange reason, he felt an edge as she approached Rue.
Step away, you filth.
Before he took another step, he noticed what he was clenching. A bone. He eyed it for a moment. Glaring at it, he then stared at the hill that Rue was sitting at. His body flickered, and his senses engaged. He could sense that the pile had some form of a residue. Not a physical residue, only something that his senses could pick up, only something that a headhunter could notice.
Death.
Indeed, he sensed that there was a residue of dead people, spirits, leftover souls from previous kills. He knew in an instant this was the lair of a speechless. But Rue did not know this. He continued to listen, but approached ever so slowly, crawling along the dirt hill, trying to avoid the bones, for even though the water made him silent, he still could crush bones, and they would echo greatly in a place like this.
Yes, I remember when we built this place. So nice. When me and Henry had created this place. It was our hope, our dream. Oh, Henry. How wonderful he was. How delicious he tasted.
Rue looked up. She stopped her chewing, her eyes fixed on the old woman. She took notice, turning to Rue, her eyes somewhat flickered in the fire.
Oh, my dear, do you not know the taste
and flesh of something so delicious.
Her back hunched. It stretched like rubber, and it stretched away from her legs. But there were not just one pair of legs now. There seemed 2 more sets, bulging out of different parts of her dress. Her hands became long and withered. Her skin grew even more pale, and it seemed to attach itself more and more to her own bones. Long, spidery fingers, and her nose grew out like that of a goblin's. Her ears pointed like a bat's, and her eyes grew crimson red with black irises.
Now, my dearie, there's no need to be afraid. Granny will take care of you. Granny will be good to you.
The monstrous Granny towered over Rue. Stepping towards her, it shook the entire chamber.
Granny kind will be kind to you, sweetie. There's nothing to fear.
A strange liquid dripped from her lips as she said this. Rue screamed in horror, and Granny Kind picked her up, holding her in her long fingers, and brought her to her face.
Granny kind will be ever so gentle as I nibble on her bones.
She outstretched her mouth like a snake unhinging its jaw, and her tongue slithered out like a worm's, flapping against her lips and her cheeks. She reached for Rue to come closer, her feet dangling towards her mouth, Rue crying out in fear and panic, and then... Talonus slashed at one of the legs of Granny Kind. She fell to some of her knees and dropped Rue.
Granny kind is not so kind anymore.
She tried to get up, but in another sweep, Talonus cut 2 more legs. Talonus's screech echoed through the chamber. Many rocks fell, and Granny Kind covered her ears.
The crow!
She screeched and wailed, Talonus crawling up her back with each of his scythes. He cut deeper and deeper and came to her neck. Granny Kind reached and grabbed him, throwing him to the pile of bones. They crashed and cracked. But he quickly got up. Facing Granny Kind, he screeched back at her. Granny Kind reciprocated. Two monstrous fiends crying at one another. And in an instant, Talonus leaped into the air and slashed right at Granny Kind before she could grab him. Her body toppled to the ground, and her head fell. Her eyes gleamed at Rue, and with one final breath, said, Black blood poured all around her head. Talanis finally settling down, the withering tentacles and tendrils going back into him, he turned to Rue, thinking upon the words of Granny Kind. Though not knowing if he should trust them or not, he eyed Rue.
What do you hide from me, little one?
Rue shriveled up. She turned away from Talanis in shame and fear. Talanis almost for a moment felt remorse for this, but it quickly withered away. He turned back to the head of Granny Kind, picked up the head, lodged a hook hard and heavy into her forehead, and let it hang. He turned back to Rue, and, surprisingly, in an angerous roar, said,
Come now, there's no more time to waste.
She climbed upon the back of Talanis. He crawled and scaled the wall of the hole they had come down. Reaching the surface, Talanis dropped her down to the ground and said,
I should cut you down now. You are speechless. It must be. You hide your form. Why do you hide it? Why is it that you cause me to feel?
Kind?
Rue said. He stopped for a moment, his eyes peering right at her, an intense stare. He knew not what to say. Kindness? How could he feel kindness? There was no hope. There was no peace. There was nothing. The endless is everything. He had no fear, and having no fear he could hunt. And for having no fear he had no hope, and having no hope caused him no remorse. The loss or death of anyone was of no concern to him. He was greater, stronger, faster. He was... A crack. The house crushed before the hand of the faithless. Talanis had not noticed it. He'd become distracted. He now realized that it also had to be because of Rue.
Stand aside. I will deal with you in a moment.
Talanis, stepping in front of her, stood before the gaping hand. It reached out and smashed the ground right before Talanis. Talanis took one step back, ever so slightly. The thing lifted its face and body from the ground. It was 4 stories high. It was great and large, grey and rocky, but its face, or at least where a face should have been, was a gaping black hole. In this dark chasm, something awoke. An eye, similar to Talanis's, but it seemed to have a slight tint of green and purple. As it looked out, it reached its hand towards the pair of them. Talanis, in an instant, crafted a black axe and slashed at the great hand. It retracted its hand. It clenched it, and then with a mighty fist brought it down towards Talanis.
Out of the way!
He pushed Rue, and then brought up the axe, pushing it against the hand, almost effortlessly, until the hand broke open and like a spider grappled around Talanis. He screeched out. He tried to break free, the tendrils wrapping around the fingers, attempting to pull them away. But it was of no use. The faithless did not care. It tossed him aside to the ground and turned towards Rue. It looked at her for a moment, lifting its body up with both hands. The lower half of its body was gone. It dragged itself towards her, almost as if it was so determined. It was as if it thirsted for water. Reaching out with its right hand, it tried to grab her. But Talonus, in an instant, slashed again, slashing at its arm. The Faithless, almost casually looking down at him, as if he were a small ant, pushed him down to the ground with his thumb. Talonus broke free quickly, rushing around his fingers, and jumped upon his arm, rushing towards the head. But his left arm intercepted, and he brushed off Talonus, tossing him in front of Rue. Talonus falling to the ground. His tendrils retracted back, and he peered up. The Faithless's eye was now coursing crimson red, with a white, piercing center, like a red star. It looked at Rue. It leaned in, and as it approached with its left hand, the Faithless retracted, for another light had formed. A golden orange light. The lantern from Talonus was being lifted by a small girl. The small girl, though, was much brighter than the lantern. She emanated with a sparking, lightning-like flame of orange and gold light. She connected her hand with the lantern, opening it up and touching the flame. The flame came out. It sat in her hand, as if it were a bird pecking at her fingers. She giggled, and as she put her hand up, the flame blew into sparkling oranges and yellows, like mini fireworks, but they got bigger and bigger, and eventually the light flew towards the Faithless. The Faithless, almost afraid by this, turned back and moved its hands towards its face and body, trying to cover itself. It roared. And it grew silent. The dark chasm was no more. The head fell apart, and so did the body into dust. The cloud of dust blew over the two of them. And after it settled, Rue, covered in so much of it, looked over at Talonus and smiled, proud of what she had just accomplished. Talonus gazed at her with an obsessive gaze. He could not believe it. An inspired was before him. It must have been why every single creature sought so desperately to get her. If there was a normal human, they may have paid no mind. But with her, she drew everything towards her. She carried hope in her little soul. It is why Talonus could feel these emotions, for headhunters could only feel these feelings by either draining a soul capsule or by having an inspired nearby. Talonus stood up, looked down at Rue, and said,
"Forgive me, little one.
He kneeled.
I did not know."
He bowed his head before her, the white, orb-like eyes closed for the first time. Rue touched his head and said,
Thank you, little birdie.
Talonus looked up, his eyes widening.
You are much more valuable than obtaining a soul capsule.
The Headhunters stood up. Knowing he would have to return to New Hope, he would have to make sure that Rue would be claimed by him. For Headhunters, to find an inspired was like finding buried treasure. You would not want to share it, and if you did, you would want to share it sparingly. And to claim it, you would have to make it official. Talinus, putting forth his hand, said,
If you desire, I would greatly hope that you would be my companion. But only by oath can this be done.
For a moment, Rue said nothing. Her face blank, staring towards the ground and towards the feet of Talinus. She looked up, with both mournful and hopeful eyes, and said,
Will you protect me?
Always.
and with that, they bonded their hands together, light flickering and shadows withering. Their hands let go, and a scar was upon both their hands. A white, clear-cut scratch across the hand of Talinus, flickering with a lightning-like light. And Ruse, an orangish purple glowing from her little palm, flickering with a strange ethereal light. The two looked at each other. Now, both alone, they would journey into the wastes, towards hope, a new hope. For, even in the darkest of times, even in the strangest of places, the ones we do not know, that we don't understand, who are strangers before us, are not always monsters hiding in the skin of people, nor untrustworthy, lying, begging fools. Some, indeed, are little pieces of hope, angels in the shadow, that when a good deed is done, reward is given.